Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. I was folding laundry in the living room when I noticed the envelope peeking out from beneath the stack of mail on the kitchen counter. At first, I thought it was just another bill or maybe one of those bland greeting cards from the dentist reminding us to book another cleaning. But there was something different about this one. My name was written on it, just my name, spelled out in neat, careful handwriting I didn't immediately recognize. And when I turned it over, I saw no return address. Curiosity got the better of me. I dried my hands, walked to the counter, and picked it up. The paper felt thick and expensive, the kind of stationery people don't use anymore unless they're trying to say something important. I hesitated for a moment. My husband, Mark, was out back fixing one of the boards on the fence, humming to himself as always. I watched him through the window, took a breath, and opened the letter. The paper inside was folded into thirds, and as I unfolded it, I noticed the handwriting again. Elegant, steady. The kind of script that told me this wasn't rushed or scribbled on a whim. The first line stopped me cold. Dear Elaine, I hope you can forgive the way this letter finds you. I've held back for years, but silence has become heavier than the truth. My hands trembled, just slightly. I had to sit down. My body went to the armchair out of habit, but my mind was scrambling, unsure where this was going or who exactly it was from. I read on, my pulse quickening with each sentence. You and I have only shared brief conversations over the years, small talk at dinner parties, a passing comment at Mark's retirement gathering. But those brief moments left a deeper impression on me than I think you could ever guess. I swallowed hard, already feeling a tension behind my eyes I didn't know how to name. It wasn't fear, not quite. Not discomfort either. It was more like a sense that something long submerged was about to break the surface. I've known Mark since we were both boys. He was always the brighter one, the better one, the lucky one. He had a light that people gathered around. When he introduced me to you that first summer at the lake house, I remember being stunned into silence. I stopped reading. The lake house. That was almost 25 years ago. I'd been newly married, still unsure of myself in those early months. I remembered the trip, of course. The laughter, the campfire, the awkward way Mark's friend, Peter, I think, had offered to help me carry the groceries in from the car. I hadn't thought about him in years. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the letter, still unread. Peter. That night came back to me in a wave. He had offered me a glass of wine by the water while Mark was grilling. We talked about books, of all things. I had mentioned something about longing for stories that didn't rush to conclusions, and he had smiled at that, a quiet smile, like he understood. I turned back to the letter. I knew then that I had to keep my distance. You were not mine to know that way. And I respected Mark, and you, far too much to ever blur the lines. But the truth is, Elaine, every time we've met since, I've carried a small ache. Not just desire, but admiration. A quiet reverence. You made it look so easy, holding your family together, supporting him, smiling through the long years. But I saw you. I saw when you were tired, when your eyes darted toward the door, when your fingers lingered too long on your coffee cup, as if bracing for something more. I stared at the words, not breathing. The silence in the room seemed louder now, pulsing against my ears. Mark was still out back, humming the same tune. I could hear the creak of the fence gate as he tested it. The normalness of the moment clashed so deeply with the weight of what I was reading that I almost laughed. Almost. This letter isn't meant to disrupt your life. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to give you this truth before time swallows the chance. You've meant something to me, something real and respectful, even from a distance. If it comforts you to forget this letter, burn it. But if it lingers, if it stays with you the way you've stayed with me, then maybe it was worth writing. I couldn't move for several minutes after I finished. My eyes scanned the page over and over again, hoping to find a crack, some break in the facade that would turn it into a misunderstanding. But it was honest. Every word of it was deliberate, measured, but brimming with feeling. I folded it back up slowly and held it in my lap. There was no plan forming in my mind, no secret thrill, no sudden urge to act. Just the heaviness of emotion I hadn't expected, and the quiet awareness that someone had seen me all these years, even when I felt invisible. That night, I tucked the letter into the drawer beside my bed, beneath old scarves and forgotten bracelets. I didn't tell Mark. I didn't know what to say, or if I'd ever say anything at all. But I dreamt of the lake house. I dreamt of the moonlight bouncing off the water, and a man watching from the shadows, with kind eyes and a heart full of restraint. The days that followed passed in fragments. I would catch myself staring at the window, my reflection staring back, softer than I remembered. I cooked dinner, folded sheets, called our daughter like I always did, but inside, I was humming with a quiet disruption I couldn't quite name. 2 weeks passed before the second letter arrived. This one was smaller, on thinner paper, but the handwriting was the same. Mark was out getting groceries, and I knew I had only a few minutes alone. My fingers were sure this time, unfolding the letter like I was preparing to meet an old part of myself. Elaine, I didn't expect a reply. I understand if there never is one. But I wanted to say one more thing. The words seemed softer, more fragile. When you smiled at me that night on the deck, when you tilted your head and asked me what I was afraid of, I lied. I said I wasn't afraid of anything. But the truth was, I was afraid of knowing what it would feel like to fall for someone I could never have. You, with your thoughtful questions and your quiet strength, reminded me of something I didn't believe I deserved. I found myself touching my lips, remembering that night as if the memory had just uncurled itself from the shadows. I had forgotten that conversation completely. Or maybe I had tucked it away on purpose, unsure of what it meant back then. I hope you're well. I hope Mark is well. I won't write again unless you choose to respond. But thank you for the grace you never knew you gave me. Yours truly, Peter. I reread that last line again and again. Peter. I sat for a long while after that, alone in the kitchen, the sound of the refrigerator buzzing in the background. My life was whole, my marriage steady. Mark and I had built something strong, weathered the usual storms, aged into comfort. But there are layers in every woman that even time doesn't smooth away. This letter didn't threaten what I had. It reminded me of what still lived inside me. That I could be admired. That someone had listened. That I was not just a wife, a mother, a woman in the kitchen, but someone seen. And maybe that was enough to shake my hands. The days after the second letter felt like walking through a room I'd lived in for years, but suddenly noticing every detail. How the light hit the floor at 3 in the afternoon, the pattern of the wallpaper I'd stopped seeing, the curve of Mark's profile as he read the news at the table each morning. Everything felt sharper, more present, as though my senses had woken up from a long, slow sleep. And yet I said nothing. Not to Mark. Not to anyone. Peter's letter stayed tucked in the drawer, just like the first. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, about him. Not in the way a woman might think of a lover or a lost opportunity, but more like revisiting a book you'd forgotten you once loved, and discovering underlined passages you don't remember marking. His words had awakened something quieter, deeper. Not desire exactly, but remembrance. Of myself, mostly. One evening, I stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes while Mark watched a game in the den. The window was open, and a soft breeze drifted in, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and distant barbecue. It reminded me of that summer at the lake house, of the stillness that fell over the water just before sunset, of Peter's voice, low and careful, asking me if I believed people ever truly saw each other. That question had floated back to me lately, uninvited but persistent. I wasn't sure I had an answer. Not then, not even now. After I dried my hands, I wandered back to the bedroom and opened the drawer. My fingers found the edge of the second letter before I even looked. I read it again, then the first, then both, back to back, letting the words stir the same quiet ache. Mark came into the room unexpectedly, and I slid the letters shut just as he entered. He smiled at me, and I smiled back. That was our rhythm, comfortable, familiar. He kissed my forehead, said something about the neighbor's dog finally staying out of our yard, and I nodded, responding with something half-heard and automatic. But inside, I was in a different place entirely. That night, after Mark fell asleep, I sat up in bed with a small notebook I hadn't used in years. It had once been a journal, though I hadn't written in it since our daughter left for college. The pages were still clean. I didn't write much, just a few lines, words that weren't answers, but reactions. I needed to put something down, if only to understand what I was feeling. A few days later, I found myself in the attic, going through old boxes. I told myself I was just looking for a set of candlesticks I'd promised to lend my sister, but in truth, I needed space. Space to breathe, to think. I came across a dusty photo album from the lake house trip. There we were, younger, sunburned, smiling. There was a photo someone else had taken, me standing near the water, barefoot, laughing at something. Peter was in the background, looking away, almost as if he didn't know the camera was on him. I stared at that picture for a long time, and I made a decision. I wrote back. It was short, no more than a page. I told him I had received both letters, that I didn't know how to respond, not really, that I appreciated his honesty, his restraint, that I remembered the night on the deck, though not the details, and that I had, over the years, occasionally wondered what he thought of me. I ended it simply, saying I wasn't sure what else to say, but that his words had reached me in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't even sign it with affection, just my name. Elaine. I didn't tell Mark I was writing it. I just walked down to the post box the next morning and mailed it. My heart beat faster than I liked to admit the whole walk home. I felt exposed and unsettled, but also lighter. As if by acknowledging Peter's words, I had released something I hadn't known I was holding. A week passed, then another. I began to think maybe that was it, that he wouldn't reply, and I told myself I was fine with that. It wasn't like I wanted anything more. I wasn't chasing a secret affair or unraveling my marriage. I just needed to know I hadn't imagined the meaning behind those letters. Then, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, another envelope arrived. Same handwriting. I opened it on the porch, alone, with a cup of tea in my lap. Elaine, when I saw your name on the return address, I sat still for nearly half an hour before I opened it. I didn't know if I should feel grateful or ashamed, but when I read your words, calm, clear, kind, I felt a peace I hadn't expected. You wrote that you weren't sure what else to say, and maybe that's the heart of it. Maybe not everything needs a conclusion. Maybe knowing we've been seen, truly seen, is enough. I've thought a lot about that night on the deck, too. You probably don't remember the way you looked at the stars when you talked, like they were old friends you hadn't spoken to in a while. I think that's when I knew you carried a kind of loneliness that no one else seemed to notice, not even Mark. And yet you never asked for pity or drama. You just carried it, gracefully. I won't write again unless you ask me to. I meant what I said. I don't want to disrupt your life, but I wanted to thank you for replying, for acknowledging me, for existing in the exact way you do. Be well, Peter. I folded the letter and sat very still. The sun was setting beyond the trees in the backyard, casting a warm golden light across the porch railings. I could hear Mark inside, laughing at something on TV. The sounds of my life were all around me, unchanged. And yet something had shifted. Not between us, not in any dangerous way, but inside me. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. I looked at my face, the lines around my eyes, the softness of my jaw. I wasn't young anymore, but I was still here, still feeling, still complex. I touched the silver strand that curled away from my hairline, and I smiled. Peter had seen me, not as an accessory to my husband, not as a background figure in someone else's story, but as a woman, a whole one, and that mattered more than I could have ever expected. That night, when Mark rolled over in his sleep and rested his hand on my hip, I covered his hand with mine. And for a moment, I let the feeling settle of being held, of being known, even by two men in different ways. I didn't know what would come next. But I knew I would never forget the way those words, simple, handwritten, heartfelt, had found a part of me that I'd nearly forgotten was still alive. The first few mornings after that last letter were quieter. Not in the way the house sounded, but in how I moved through it. I stopped rushing through breakfast. I paused when pouring my coffee, letting the scent settle around me before taking that first sip. I let the soft sun filter in through the curtains and just sat still. Mark noticed, of course. He always noticed more than I gave him credit for. "You're different lately," he said one morning, leaning against the doorway as I stood at the kitchen counter, slicing apples. "Not bad different. Just lighter, maybe." I smiled at him without looking up. "Maybe I've just been thinking more." He nodded slowly, then walked over and kissed the top of my head, just like he used to when we were younger. I felt my chest pull tight for a second. That simple touch, so familiar and warm, somehow hit me harder now. Later that day, I went out for a walk, alone. I passed the park where we used to take our daughter when she was little. The swings were empty, creaking in the wind. I sat on one of the benches and took the latest letter out of my coat pocket. I hadn't meant to bring it, but I had. It was folded, worn a bit at the corners now from being opened and refolded so many times. I read it again. This time, something shifted. It wasn't just Peter's words that held weight. It was the memory of being acknowledged, of someone seeing what I had hidden so quietly for years. I had spent so long being the strong one, the reliable one, the glue of the family. People always assumed I had it all together because I smiled through it. But inside, there were days I felt like I was walking underwater, slow and heavy, barely curd. Peter's letters reminded me of the woman I had been before I became a wife and mother. A woman who used to stay up late reading poetry, who used to write in notebooks and dream about road trips along the coast. Somewhere along the line she'd faded, but not disappeared. When I got home, Mark was in the garage sorting through his old tools, humming off-key like he always did when he was in a good mood. I watched him for a moment before stepping inside and closing the door gently behind me. The house was quiet again. I found my journal and opened to the last page I had written. Then I turned to a fresh one and started writing, not to Peter, not even to myself, but to that part of me I had buried. the voice that had been quiet for too long. I wrote for an hour, maybe longer. When I finally put the pen down, my hand ached, but my heart felt strangely calm. I hadn't realized how much I needed to give shape to what I was feeling, to name the things I thought had long gone dormant. The next day, I received a package. It wasn't large, just a slim brown envelope addressed to me. The return name was scribbled simply, P.H. Inside was a small book, a poetry collection. I recognized the title instantly. It was a rare edition I had once mentioned years ago during that conversation on the deck at the lake house. I had said something like, "If I ever find that edition, I'll keep it by my bed forever." I turned the cover with reverence. Inside was a note tucked gently between the pages. "I found this in a second-hand shop last year. I thought of you immediately. I never had the courage to send it, until now. You once said you liked stories that took their time. Maybe this is one of them." There was no signature, just that. I closed the book slowly and held it to my chest. Something in me felt undone, but not broken, like a door you finally open after years, unsure what you'll find inside, only to discover something deeply familiar and unexpectedly tender. That evening, I made dinner like usual. Chicken roasted in rosemary, mashed potatoes with extra garlic the way Mark liked. He set the table without me asking, and when we sat down, he poured us both a glass of wine. Midway through the meal, he looked up at me, chewing thoughtfully, and said, "You ever think about that summer at the lake house?" I paused, wine glass halfway to my lips. "Sometimes," I said. "Why?" He shrugged, but there was something careful in his tone. "Just remembered that trip out of nowhere. You seemed happy there." I smiled faintly. I was. He nodded, then looked down at his plate. I could see him weighing whether or not to say more, but in the end, he didn't, and I didn't press. That night, I sat on the porch by myself, the poetry book on my lap. I read the words slowly, letting them breathe. There was a verse that caught me. "There are glances in life that stretch longer than years, moments that mark us with invisible ink." I read that line over and over, until I felt something warm press at the back of my throat. When I went to bed, I didn't hide the book. I placed it openly on my nightstand, its cover catching the soft glow of the lamp. Mark noticed it, glanced at it, then said nothing. But before he turned over to sleep, he touched my arm. "Love you," he said simply. "I know," I whispered back. And I did. I loved him. That hadn't changed. But love, I was realizing, isn't a single neat container. Sometimes it's layered. Sometimes it's history and habit. Sometimes it's unspoken recognition from someone who passed through your life like a quiet breeze and stayed in ways no one else could see. I didn't know what I would do next, if I'd respond again, if there was anything else to say. But I knew this. I was alive. I was awake. And I was more than I had let myself believe for a very long time. A few weeks had passed since the book arrived, and something about the rhythm of my days had changed, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but the change was there. I began noticing the way light filtered across the hardwood floors in the late afternoon. I let music play while I cooked, old records I hadn't listened to in years. And every now and then, I'd pause to reread a single line of poetry from Peter's book, then sit in silence and let it settle over me. It wasn't longing, not in the way stories so often portray it. It was something gentler, like discovering a forgotten photograph of yourself from decades ago and realizing you'd once been someone who dared to dream differently. One morning, I opened the bottom drawer of my nightstand. I unfolded each letter again, carefully, like they were made of something more delicate than paper. I didn't cry. I didn't ache. I just read them with a kind of reverence, as if they were the missing pages of a chapter in my life I hadn't realized needed telling. That afternoon, Mark asked if I wanted to go out for dinner. We didn't do that often anymore. Restaurants had grown loud, the portions too large, the noise unsettling. But I said yes. He chose the small Italian place downtown where we used to go for anniversaries. I wore a dress I hadn't touched in years, navy blue with a soft neckline. When I came down the stairs, Mark looked up from his shoes and smiled, slowly, appreciatively. He didn't say anything, but the way he touched the small of my back as we walked to the car said more than words ever could. Over dinner, we talked about the garden, about our daughter's upcoming visit, about the neighbor's new puppy. Nothing extraordinary, but there was ease in the air, a softness between us I hadn't felt in a while. As we sipped our coffee after dessert, Mark cleared his throat, then leaned in slightly. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice low. "Of course," I replied. "Have you been thinking about someone?" The words landed gently, like feathers, but they still landed. I met his eyes. "What makes you say that?" He hesitated, then smiled. "You've been lighter, softer. I know you, Elaine. I've known you through every version of our life together. And lately you've seemed like someone who's rediscovered something. Or someone. I didn't look away." "That a problem for you?" Mark shook his head slowly. "No, I think it's good. You've given so much to this family. To me, you've carried things I didn't always see. If someone reminded you of who you were before all that, before we built this life, I am glad." I took a deep breath, letting it fill the quiet between us. "There was a letter," I finally said. He nodded, unsurprised. "An old friend of yours," I continued, "from the lake house. Peter." The name settled in the space like dust in the air. "I didn't ask for it," I said. "He wrote. I didn't know how to feel at first. I still don't fully. But his words, they saw a part of me I didn't even realize had gone quiet." Mark didn't speak right away. He just looked at me, and there was something in his eyes. Age, understanding, maybe even regret. "I always knew he looked at you differently," he said at last. "But I also knew he respected you, respected us." He did. Mark reached across the table, took my hand. His was rougher than I remembered. Warm, real. "We've been through decades together, Elaine. Life in all its strange ways. If he gave you something I couldn't, some moment of clarity, of remembering who you were before we had bills and grandkids and aching knees, then I'm grateful." I swallowed past the lump in my throat. "I love you." "I know you do," he said, smiling gently. "That's never been the question." That night, back at home, we climbed into bed together. Not out of habit, but out of choice. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. The comfort of shared silence said enough. The next morning, I wrote Peter one final time. I didn't begin with small talk or formalities. I simply wrote what I felt. "Peter, thank you for your honesty, for your restraint, for seeing a woman who, for a long time, forgot to look inward. You reminded me of parts of myself I hadn't visited in years, not because of you alone, but because your words arrived at a time when I needed to remember. And now I do. You don't need to write again. Truly. This isn't a door swinging open. It's a window briefly raised to let the breeze through. And now I'm closing it softly with gratitude. Be well. Be kind to yourself. Live honestly as you have. Elaine. I mailed it with calm hands. Weeks passed. The season changed. The trees began to shed their golden leaves, scattering them across our lawn like little reminders of time's gentle march. I still read from the poetry book, not every day, but often enough to remember what it meant. I still walked in the park. I still folded Mark's socks. I still laughed at silly sitcoms and burned toast once in a while. But inside me, something was different. I had remembered who I was, who I had been, and who I still could be. Not in spite of the years that had passed, but because of them. Sometimes all it takes is a letter. A few words strung together by someone who truly sees you, not to change your life, but to bring you back to it. And for that, I would always be thankful.